workshop is called Developing an Ally-Tude. So it's really about thinking about how can we develop a mindset and an approach when we are thinking about being an ally to marginalized groups. And so I'm going to start us off with another poll. So I'm going to launch that, and I'll give folks a minute to do that as well, and maybe grab a drink or anything else that you need. And as we're waiting for the last few folks to fill out the survey, I'm also going to drop a question in the chat. And as you're comfortable to respond just in the chat, you can just respond to that question just with whatever comes to your mind off the top of your head, which is what words, images, thoughts, etc. come to mind when you hear the word ally. So if you're comfortable enough, feel free to just drop that into the chat, and I'll give you a couple minutes to put anything there. I'll give you one more minute. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, so I think you should be able to see. Let me share the results there. So if you take a look at the, we'll start by looking at the poll results. The cat's going to analyze them for us. I have been part of an ally training before. Yes, 9 people, no, 16 people. So more no's than yeses there. I have a good understanding of what allyship and solidarity means. Even split there, it looks like, between yes and not sure. That seems, yeah, that makes sense to me. I would consider myself an ally. 13 say yes, 1 says no, depending on the group, 8, and not sure again, 3. So I think that those are pretty interesting and give us sort of a good sense of how widespread this idea is. Looking at some of the things in the chat, people had said friendship, standing with, understanding, advocate. A few people said that, championing for, got your back, petition letters, recognizing the important struggles of your peers, kinship, human library, strategic partnership, side by side, cooperating for a purpose. Awesome, those are all really great. And I think that what they're highlighting is that there's a huge variety of things that an ally can mean. So I'm going to ask if there is anyone who will be bold enough to share out loud verbally for them, like an example of allyship that they try and demonstrate or that they've seen someone else demonstrate, or something around what their idea of an ally is. So feel free to unmute and share, and I'm very comfortable to sit in silence for a little bit while people are gathering their thoughts.
I have one thing to share. I think the recent MOE issues where the student was protesting, I think that's one of the great example of allyship.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there was demonstrated support in support of transgender students being able to get the care and the medical support that they need. Yeah, definitely. Anyone else have an example that they've seen or that they've tried to do in their own life or that you'd like to share?
I can go.
Sure.
Hi, you.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. I just want to share because I was very fortunate to be trained by Andrew in many situations in allyship and supporting survivors of sexual violence. And I guess one aspect of allyship is just the doing of it. So making sure that you ask. So let's say you're in a room with a bunch of people, asking if people are comfortable sharing their pronouns, and then affirming that. So just asking what people need from you and making sure that you like live up to that by doing it consistently.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. So I'll move on a little bit, but there will be more times for you to work on being bold and sharing. I know it's a bit difficult on Zoom. Something I was known for at my trainings at Yale and US was the ability to stand in front of the full room of people in person and just be silent for as long as it took. And something I learned through all of those years of doing that is that people always have something to say. And a lot of us just get uncomfortable with the silence and just move on immediately. But if you wait for up to 1 minute, 2 minutes, which feels like an eternity, someone is always processing and then has something really insightful to share. So on Zoom, it's a bit more awkward, I think, because I can't see any of you, so I don't know what you all are doing. But anyway, okay, so we'll move on a little bit. So for those of you who maybe have not been to an ally training before or who are sort of having some learnings reinforced, what is an ally? So that's a good question to ask. So the word has historically been used to sort of describe someone who has privilege in a certain identity category, who then will use that privilege to support marginalized groups. So for instance, I'm male, identified, cisgender male, so I can become an ally to women, to non-binary folks, to trans folks, to genderqueer folks, etc. Am I by default an ally? No. Which is why I say that I can become an ally if that's something that I am wanting to pursue. And so when folks are aspiring to be allies, it should be really around amplifying, supporting, and standing with marginalized folks, not speaking for them. So it's not really up to me to decide what issues are most important to women. But if I have the opportunity to advocate for those issues and understand them in a way that could be helpful, then that is something that I can do. And because people with more privilege tend to have more access to different spaces that other folks don't have, it's about bringing those concerns to the spaces. But again, it's understanding what those concerns are. So not necessarily just me saying, oh, I think women's issues are X, Y, and Z, but that I've done my own self-education, I've attended talks, I've spoken with people, and I have a more robust understanding. And an ally should be doing their own self-work and the work of engaging with others of their same privileged identity group. So I really firmly believe in that. Self-education is so important. And now I have just found, and you all know this already, that like a simple Google search of anything will tell you what you need to know. So if there were, again, someone brought up the example of the MOE situation with trans-identified students. Maybe for some people, they wanted to sort of engage in that conversation, but they weren't even sure sort of what some of the issues were. but a simple Google search of like, what issues face transgender students, and you'll have a ton of information right at your hands. So it's about sort of doing that. If we're demonstrating our allyship, it's that we're taking the initiative to take our own time and our own resources to learn. And something that I read a very long time ago that always stuck with me is what I noted here down at the bottom, which was that if you're wanting to work on allyship and Ally-Tude and solidarity, it's not really about how many members of the marginalized group you know. It's about how many members of the privileged group you engage with on these issues. So if I'm male identified, it's important for me to do the work of maybe challenging and trying to educate other men who are maybe behaving in ways that might be perceived as sexist or misogynist, and sort of responding to that and not leaving that labor to women and other gender minorities. So it's really about thinking about how do I engage with that, which of course can be sometimes difficult. Because sometimes people will take the perspective that, well, if someone from that community isn't present right now to hear these comments, then it's okay to make them. So it's thinking about, okay, but if I'm in that space, how can I say, hey, actually, it's not appropriate to use that word to describe someone, or that seems, sort of like a comment that's rooted in sexism or racism. Maybe you want to think about something else. So yeah, a little bit more about being an ally. Yeah, it's not necessarily that there's a single achievement, it's a skill set that acknowledges the journey. And I really appreciate the second point that I've put here, which is about recognizing common humanity and having the difficult conversations, maybe intervening in situations, maybe what might be perceived as calling someone out, doing that because it's right, and challenging the unfair norms because they should be challenged, not because someone is sort of sitting right there who's experiencing it, and not because you think it might benefit you in some kind of way, but because it's the right thing to do. And of course, we all have different capacities to engage at different times, so it might not always be possible in every moment to intervene. If we did that, we'd just all be intervening all the time. But thinking about when can I have the capacity to sort of stand up. And so, again, being an ally is not an identity, it's a process. Which is why I had titled this Developing an Ally-Tude and not like Becoming an Ally, because becoming sort of makes it sound like, okay, if I follow steps 1 through 100, I'll just be an ally at the end. But that's not really how it works, because language constantly changes, experiences change, laws change, all of these things change, and then that impacts different groups in different ways. And so we do have to be continuously sort of learning on our own and with others. And so it means advancing, naming, and discussing needs of marginalized groups, even if no members of that group are present. So thinking about how can I be well-versed enough to raise these issues if they're not going to be raised in general. Yeah, so thinking about what's an Ally-Tude. So yeah, it's a word I made up. It's not steeped in research or anything. It just came to me and I thought it was catchy enough. So I think about it as like a mindset. So instead of thinking about allyship as like a label or an identity, you think about having an Ally-Tude as an approach. So the same way that you have sort of an attitude or an approach towards the way you do your work, towards the way you do your schooling, you can have an Ally-Tude towards the way that you approach these sort of issues of marginalization and social issues that exist. So it would be really thinking about curiosity, compassion, and understanding. And I think what can be hard sometimes is accepting that just because I don't understand something doesn't mean it's not true. And I think we all know that sort of intellectually, but sometimes embracing it emotionally can be a bit more of a different kind of experience. And so cultivating an Ally-Tude would understand that we can't directly understand the impact of marginalization on a specific individual, and encourages listening and learning. So even if I have a marginalized group identity, my experience of that identity might also be very different than somebody else's. And so it's that we really are all living our own very unique, complex, and nuanced lives. And we can't truly understand somebody else's, though of course we can develop that empathy and that understanding. And that takes time, which I think is sometimes what puts people off of doing this kind of work, is that it is labor intensive, it is time intensive, and it can be stressful. Sometimes if you're part of a privileged group and you start finding out all of the ways that a marginalized group is oppressed in different ways and sort of pushed to the margins and to the sidelines, you may feel stressed by that. Or you may feel overwhelmed, like, oh, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what to do. And so, but leaning into that and figuring out, okay, how can I develop more understanding if this is an issue I really care about? And so I think when we develop Ally-Tude and solidarity, we actually really decenter ourselves and we really think about others. So it is very much an exercise in empathy. and understanding again that just because we haven't experienced something doesn't mean that it's not real for that person and doesn't mean that it's not valid. So I found this quote, which I quite liked from Sarah Ahmad, which says, solidarity does not assume that our struggles are the same or that our pain is the same or that our hope for the future is the same. But solidarity involves commitment and work, as well as the recognition that even if we don't have the same feelings, lives, or bodies, we do live on common ground. And I think that's a really succinct and helpful way of thinking about what allyship can look like. So as I mentioned before, I always like to think about how do we make it practical? So you might be thinking like, yeah, okay, that all sounds fine. And then what am I actually supposed to do? Like, I still don't know what step to take. So I love any kind of continuum. So there is this is called an action continuum for allyship or solidarity. And you can sort of see on the side, on the left side, you would have sort of supporting oppression, which would be like actively participating in something that's happening, all the way through sort of confronting oppression. And it's not necessarily that if you're on the left, if you're denying or ignoring that means you're a horrible person. It's nothing like that. I think it is that not all of us have had the same opportunities to learn. And so sometimes we are participating maybe passively because we've not actually been informed. So I think about that with language a lot. Sometimes, especially across cultures, different language used to describe things is more or less acceptable. So I may think, oh, that's a really inappropriate word to use. But someone else doesn't because that hasn't been a conversation that they've had before. So I think it is important to not sort of say like, oh, well, I just didn't know, and so that's an excuse, but to accept that, yeah, there's lots of things we don't know. And so of course, at some point, someone might tell me, hey, that's not a very nice thing to say, or that's not a very helpful thing to say. So what I want to do, again, you'll have the opportunity to share out, is look at this scenario. I'll read it out loud. And then for 4 different parts, which I'll tell you which ones, I'll ask someone to maybe give me an example of what it would look like, either internally in terms of a thought process or self-work, or externally in terms of an action that others could observe to act at different parts of the continuum. So again, thinking about gender and thinking about different issues related to gender identity, the scenarios that a colleague lets you and others know that they identify as gender non-binary and that their pronouns have shifted and they now use they and them as their pronouns and will be referred to as they, them. During a lunch conversation, some other colleagues are discussing this person and they make disparaging comments as well as refer to them using the wrong pronouns. So take a minute to think. And if someone could maybe share out, what would it look like internally or externally if you were acting at the actively participating part? What kinds of actions or things might you do if that's where you were in this scenario? Yep, so someone put in the chat nodding or agreeing with them. Yep, definitely.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Hi. I think for this part of the continuum, supporting oppression, actively participating might look like agreeing with the rest of the group, making disparaging comments yourself, and also maybe internally questioning why your new colleague or your colleague needs to shift their pronoun to use they and them, basically questioning the need for that.
Yep, definitely. Thank you for that. So moving on to another one, if you were in the, not that one, if you were in the recognizing and action sort of part of the continuum, what would that look like, either internally or externally? Oh, and someone also mentioned, yeah, continuing to use inaccurate pronouns. Yep, that would also be actively participating. Yeah, so what would recognizing an action look like in this situation?
Hi, Andrew.
Hello.
I think recognizing would mean that like you cognitively, like in your head, know that there's this level of discomfort because you know that they are misgendering, using the wrong pronouns for the person. But then at the same time, you feel like an inhibition or like a fear to interfere for fear of like how other people will view you if you were to intervene. So oftentimes I think a lot of people feel that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Anyone else have a thought on what that might look like for them, or even for you, what you think you might do in that situation if you were in the recognizing action area?
I suppose you could even take an action that doesn't have a very high impact, like saying oof or oh no at what they say, or for example, going and comforting your colleague later, but not really interacting with the tension that's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's so important to recognize, both when you think about a continuum and any kind of intervention act, is that it can take such a huge variety of, or there's so many ways in which you can do it. And so it might be, yeah, that you talk to that colleague separately. It might be that you pull one of these people aside, outside of a group for a one-on-one and say, hey, I noticed that you were, using this, or even just figuring out, something I learned a long time ago when sort of providing unsolicited feedback to people is that if you start with a question, you can almost always have a more robust conversation. So even being able to pull a colleague aside and say, oh, I'm not sure if you were informed yet, Andrew's now using they, them pronouns, and I noticed that you referred to them by the incorrect one at lunch. So you come from that question, oh, had you heard that this is what the situation is? I want to make sure you know first before I just go into, hey, what's wrong with you? Why are you misgendering them? That's not appropriate. Though you also could do that. But I find sometimes the question can sort of help people think through, oh, okay, did I know that information? And if not, now I have a chance also to share. And it gets people already thinking about, oh, did I know that, but I made a mistake? And maybe that's what they say. Oh, I did know that, I made a mistake. And then you can say, okay, well, we can support each other and like making sure we're more thoughtful moving forward. Okay, so moving on to a different part of the continuum. So looking at educating self, again, same scenario. What would it look like for educating self? So say you are like, I'm not really sure what this even means. What kind of steps would you take? Again, internally or externally for that one? Yep, so in the chat again, we have Googling, yeah, what are the correct pronouns to use? Yeah, or doing a Google, like what does they, them pronouns mean? What does non-binary mean? Maybe I'm not even sure. Yeah. Other ideas? Anyone else?
Hi, I'm not sure if you hear me. Just I was trying to speak. I think I was on mute. This is Billy.
Yes, we can hear.
Yep. So I was just saying, like attending like trainings like this, or like actively searching online, Googling, or even talking to people. I guess that's where I would see as educating self fall under.
Yep, definitely. Something that I also shift to sometimes instead of Google is YouTube. You'd be sort of amazed how many things are out there if you were to Google, like, what are they, them pronouns? So if you're someone who prefers to like listen to someone else explain, or to have some like sort of visual cues to like look at while you're learning, YouTube often has a lot of good information. Now, it is often also has a lot of bad information. So sometimes the videos are terrible, but there are always gems there. So sometimes you can really learn through that method as well. Maybe there's a panel that's been recorded. Maybe there's someone who has they, them pronouns who is sharing about that experience on YouTube. So they're really like, I know we default to Google and it is a great way to access information, but remember the other ways as well, that there are many ways. Okay, and then lastly, for initiating and preventing. So if you were all the way on the other side of the action continuum, which actually is probably more like a circle than it is, I hate anything that sort of is a straight line, because again, it sort of is like, oh, I get here and then I'm done. So you can think of this as more like a circle for different identities, as well as like, maybe we think we're at educating self and then we like have different experiences that sort of moves us in different ways. So thinking about initiating, preventing, what ideas might someone have again for this situation? Yes. I was just about to make that comment that this one is more difficult. Is there anyone who has any thought, even if you've shared already, and you have a thought about what this could look like? Okay, the afternoon slump has gotten to us. It's Friday afternoon. Okay, someone has put something in training. Yeah, organizing a training for the team, even if you don't already have someone that identifies as non-binary or genderqueer. Yeah, absolutely. So it's thinking about what can be a proactive solution to something like this. Something else that you could do for initiating and preventing is say that this scenario wasn't happening at your workplace, but it could at any organization, right? It's looking at some of your materials. How are the way that things are written? Are you always writing documents that say he/she? And might you propose, hey, actually, if we're being more inclusive, we can just say they and replace that so that we ensure that we're covering sort of all identities of people who might be working here. So again, whether or not there is someone who's using those pronouns, it might make a difference to someone, for instance, who's looking at that organization to see whether or not they're supportive. So there's a lot of different things you can do. So the point of the continuum is just, again, it's a way to help think about where am I within this continuum for any given sort of identity or for any sort of given issue. And if I want to move forward, what can that look like? So someone asked a question in the chat, is the use of they prevalent in Singapore? I'm not sure if you mean by people using they pronouns or like in general in terms of documentation. I would say in terms of people who identify with they pronouns, I do think it's relatively prevalent. I guess it depends on how you define prevalent. I think it is something that people are sharing more as more people are sharing that that is what they use and that they maybe don't identify within the binary or they don't or they identify as transgender. I think at Yale and US, when I was there previously, we did have a fair amount of students who use they, them pronouns. And then in terms of documentation, I would say almost never. Many documentations I see always say sort of H/ or S/HE or he/she, which yeah, I think personally is also more cumbersome than just saying they, which would include sort of everybody. So again, thinking about examples of allyship and solidarity, I do think it's always important, I think, to walk away from a training with some concrete examples that you can think about, because again, sometimes it can be very theoretical. Oh, I have a good approach to allyship, but if I'm not really sure how to do anything, it can also feel like disheartening. Like, well, I want to help. That's sometimes what people say a lot. Like, I want to help, but I don't know what to do. And so here's just a list I made just off the top of my head. So the first one I've already talked about, intervening if you think discrimination or prejudice is at play. This could be, for instance, in hiring. When I previously was doing trainings on sexual misconduct response, I talked about it a lot in terms of, might you perceive if the person who's responding, the alleged perpetrator, is male identified, might you perceive them in a certain way based on their ethnicity, based on their nationality, based on their appearance, and how can you make sure that you're not sort of having predetermined sort of stereotypes at play when you're making the decision. So again, it comes up with hiring, I think, quite a lot in terms of, is there discrimination in hiring? A lot of research has demonstrated that there is. And so how can you sort of name that when it's happening? You can donate to organizations that are led by marginalized people. You can commit yourself to an hour a week reading articles written by underrepresented groups. I think what's important is not to, if you're looking for articles, for instance, on racism in Singapore or racism in the United States, is to focus your attention on reading from people who are experiencing it and who are writing from that perspective. Not necessarily like, random white people like me. Like I don't have the same kind of take as someone who's actually experiencing it. So thinking about how can I find people who experience this who are writing about it, and that will help develop the sort of empathy and understanding more. Being informed if something that we said was offensive or inappropriate and someone says, hey, that's not cool, doing our own research to understand why. That is an example of allyship, especially if the person who calls us out is a member of that marginalized group, not expecting them to just sit there and patiently educate us while they're like, annoyed with us or hurt or harmed because of what we said. So doing our own research, just saying, hey, thanks for letting me know. I'm really sorry. Let me learn more about this on my own. Supporting minority, women, LGBTQ owned businesses. Intervening and interrupting, sexist, homophobic, ableist, racist comments, jokes you hear. And again, someone brought up before, even saying something like, oof, or like, yeah, that's, why did you say that? Or like, oh, that's not funny, or something. It doesn't always have to be something big. And I think sometimes we get caught up thinking, oh, an intervention has to be this like very long drawn out thing, but it can sometimes be as simple as, hey, don't say that in front of me. I don't think it's okay. And that can be it. But we always think of it as like, okay, long drawn out conversations. Yeah, and then the last ones would be sort of in a work or organizational setting, talking about the expertise you see in others. If you're someone who's managing a team, for instance, and you're being directed questions, but actually one of your team members who is more junior in the company and maybe has a marginalized identity, they're the ones who actually have the expertise, directing sort of questions about that to them so that they have a chance to sort of shine and speak for themselves. So thinking about the ways that we can do this at work and in our various organizations constantly is something that I think is really important. Super quick as we sort of wind down, are there any other examples that someone would want to share out, either that you've observed in your own organization, something that you maybe practice yourself, or something that maybe you've seen someone else practice? If we could get maybe like 3 examples, that would be amazing.
Hello, this is me, Billy, speaking. I've been speaking a lot today. So I think one of the examples that I have seen in my organizations is that I have recently spoken to our procurement team, and apparently, like in a lot of MNC, there has been a lot of diversity supplier kind of programs that to help underprivileged or minority in business world. So I think one of the things that I have seen our company doing is to recognize this minority group and set up like a spending kind of targets to assist and to support all this minority group. So I think that would be something that we as a organizations could do to support and be an ally to all these different minority as well.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Someone put in the chat, pause someone when they're speaking in a language that doesn't include everyone in the room. Yep, that can be a real experience of marginalization and something that I've heard like can happen in Singapore sometimes. Someone else had mentioned giving marginalized people the opportunity to speak for themselves instead of speaking for them. Yep, and figuring out how you do that in a way that feels genuine and not sort of oh, hey, you're the one, Black person in the company or the one Indian person in the company. Why don't you come over here and like talk to us about that experience? But thinking about how do we actually make this part of our sort of organizational ethos, that people are included, that voices are heard in a way that is meaningful. Yep, and then Young Fuzz added there, yeah, introducing self with name and pronouns to be able to share that. So yeah, a lot of people are doing that. You see I have it in my Zoom there, I have it in my email address. And it is something that people are using. And again, it's not because I'm, you may look at me and see cisgender male, and I do identify as cis male and use he, him pronouns, but it's normalizing that we can just maybe not make these assumptions about people. So it's normalizing that like, yeah, who knows, what my pronouns might be, but I'll share them with you. And being able to make that sort of a normal part of conversation, I think is what can be really important. Okay. So a couple final thoughts, and there are many more examples. The list of allyship behaviors is basically like infinite because there's allyship in organizations, with individuals, with our friend groups, with ourselves. There's a lot. So there's a lot of things that we can do. So my final thoughts on this issue as we wrap up is just that at the end of the day, the exact terminology doesn't really matter. It's about the mindset, it's about the approach, it's about being willing to be open and learn. Whether you say it's solidarity, allyship, Ally-Tude, whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's more just sort of like, I guess, mnemonics and like ways to talk about it with shared language that others might also understand. But it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. These things are always aspirations. As I mentioned, there's always new things to learn. Your attempts at allyship might not be acknowledged, and they don't necessarily need to be. So sometimes people also sort of get caught up in this like, oh, but I intervened one time and the person, I intervened for to support was there and they didn't say thank you afterwards. If we're doing it for those reasons, then we're not really doing it for the right reasons. And so it can be a bit sort of disheartening sometimes. And of course, it's nice to receive that validation, but it shouldn't be expected. Again, it goes back to we're doing these things because it's the right thing to do and we believe it's the right thing to do, not because we're seeking this external validation from somebody else. When you find others who are developing their own Ally-Tude and who are really trying to work, especially on a specific issue, you can work together. It's always really great to be like, hey, do you understand what's going on with this MOE thing? I don't. Can we learn together? Then you can maybe deepen friendships. You can have different kinds of conversations that you don't have, and then you don't have to feel like you're on your own, because sometimes it can be really helpful to be having this conversation with someone else. And the last thing that I just want to acknowledge is that this is a very, very brief overview. There's so much to learn about this, and that I think the most important thing would be approaching this with openness, a willingness to learn and be wrong, and a lack of ego, and just understanding, just accepting that, as soon as we can all accept that, like, we basically know, nothing, and we have so much to learn from other people to sort of enhance our own knowledge levels, then we can approach with a lack of ego, I think, in a way that is a lot more meaningful and can really develop that sort of ally behavior solidarity with others.